US President Donald Trump appears to have finally gotten what he wants, after spending almost 2 months unleashing daily airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen. Trump has just claimed victory, as the Houthis suddenly backed down from their own attacks against commercial shipping and US vessels in the Red Sea. At least, that's what the US is claiming. It wants the world to believe that the Houthis are begging the US to stop the bombing after absorbing over 800 attacks. The white flag has been raised. The Red Sea is safe again. However, the reality is that the situation may be a lot more complicated than Trump and his administration want the world to believe. On May 6, Trump made the grand announcement that the US would stop bombing the Houthis in Yemen. His reason? The two sides have come to a ceasefire agreement that Trump claims will see the militant group halt all of its attacks against commercial shipping and US vessels in the Red Sea. Speaking during a White House meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, Trump said,
"The Houthis have announced that they are not, or they've announced to us at least, that they don't want to fight anymore. They just don't want to fight, and we will honor that, and we will stop the bombings."
Trump's comments may come as a massive surprise given the intensity of the US bombing campaign in Yemen that started on March 15. For the last month and a half, the US has conducted daily airstrikes that it claims are targeting everything from Houthi leaders to the group's key military facilities. The US was shooting for a decapitation strategy. By taking out the heads of the Houthi militant arm, it hoped to sow chaos within the group. That chaos would lead to disorganization, which would in turn make it easier for ground forces, either from within Yemen or provided by other nations, to eradicate the Houthis. That doesn't seem to be happening now. The Houthis have supposedly raised the white flag.
They have capitulated, but more importantly, we will take their word. They say they will not be blowing up ships anymore.
So, that's it, right? Trump's airstrikes against the Houthis were successful to the point where the militant group has run to the hills and will leave ships sailing through the Red Sea alone. It's a little more complicated than that. There's certainly evidence to support Trump's claims that a ceasefire is on the way, assuming it's not already in force. For instance, the Foreign Ministry of Oman, which has previously served as a facilitator in negotiations between Iran and the US over Iran's nuclear program, took to X to suggest that it's involved in the ceasefire. Badr al-Busaidi, Oman's foreign minister, wrote on X, "Following recent discussions and contacts conducted by the Sultanate of Oman with the United States and the relevant authorities in Sana'a, in the Republic of Yemen, with the aim of de-escalation, efforts have resulted in a ceasefire agreement between the two sides." Al-Busaidi even laid out what appeared to be the key terms of the agreement. In the future, neither side will target the other, including American vessels in the Red Sea and Bab al-Mandab Strait, ensuring freedom of navigation and the smooth flow of international commercial shipping. That seems to be a massive win for the US. Commercial shipping, particularly via the Red Sea, has been massively disrupted since the Houthis started launching attacks in the region following Israel's decision to go to war with Hamas militants in Gaza. The Houthis started their strikes in solidarity with Gaza, and they've had a massive impact. Between October 2023 and May 2024 alone, goods valued at around $1 trillion were disrupted by the Houthis' Red Sea attacks. Many ships were forced to avoid the waterway entirely, taking a longer and costlier route around Africa's southern tip instead to mitigate the risk of attacks. Crisis Group, which points out that the Houthis control around 28% of Yemen, offers more details. It says that around 12% of global maritime trade sails through the Red Sea, most via Egypt's Suez Canal. That trade includes 40% of the world's container ship traffic. The disruption caused by the Houthi campaign has included around 500 attacks on shipping, resulting in traffic sailing through the Suez Canal dropping by more than 50%. Naturally, Egypt isn't too happy. In 2023, that canal generated $10.3 billion for Egypt. By the end of 2024, that revenue declined to just $4 billion. For Egypt, along with all of the countries and companies that use the Red Sea, the news of a ceasefire will be music to their ears. It also comes in the wake of one of the largest bombing campaigns the US has conducted in recent memory. ABC says that the Trump administration has launched more than 800 strikes against the Houthis since it started its campaign on March 15. Many of those strikes have been devastating, both to the Houthis and the civilian population of Yemen. Most of the news we've received about the impact these strikes have made comes from Yemen's health ministry, which is controlled by the Houthis and should thus be taken with a grain of salt. Typically, the ministry reports focus on providing basic death and injury tolls, with the Houthis going out of their way to avoid mentioning if any of their group were caught up in the strikes. Nevertheless, the numbers showcase the scale of the US attacks and the likelihood of vast Houthi losses. 2 strikes conducted in April stand out. On April 14, the US conducted what still stands as one of its most devastating attacks in Yemen. And since mid-March, according to the Houthi-run health ministry, US attacks have killed at least 123 people, including women and children, and injured 247 others. The ministry also released a statement at the time saying, "We hold the American administration fully responsible for its continuing crimes and massacres against civilian dignitaries and civilians and its direct and repeated bombardment of infrastructure, industrial facilities, and civil officials." Again, the focus was on the civilian impact. The US claims that all of its strikes targeted Houthi militants. 3 days later, the US hit the Houthis hard again. This time, America's bombs and missiles targeted Yemen's Ras Isa port, which the Houthis used both to receive weapons shipments from Iran and to strong-arm tax payments out of incoming ships to bolster the group's coffers. Yemen's health ministry claimed that this attack killed at least 80 people, while injuring 150 more, adding to the civilian crisis the strikes were creating in the process. The group made no mention of whether any of its members were caught up in the attack. Given the importance of Ras Isa to the Houthis, it seems unlikely that the Houthis escaped unscathed and that all deaths and injuries were of civilians. Still, these 2 attacks are the highlights, at least in terms of devastation, of a prolonged campaign that Trump is now claiming has achieved precisely what it set out to do: force a Houthi surrender. However, it's important to note that the US hasn't emerged from this conflict unscathed. Though the US hasn't experienced any casualties, it's lost some equipment as a result of Houthi counterattacks against its drones and the aircraft carrier, the USS Harry S. Truman, it uses to stage its airstrikes. On the drone front, the US has lost 7 of its Reapers since it began its bombing campaign. That's no small victory for the Houthis. Unlike many kamikaze drones, such as those Ukraine and Russia are using against one another, Reapers are expensive. Each one cost the US around $30 million to build, meaning the Houthis have managed to cost the US around $210 million by taking out 7 of them. Worse yet for the US, it also lost 2 of its fighter jets. The first jet wasn't taken down by a Houthi rocket or missile. Instead, the Houthis attempted their own drone strike against the USS Harry S. Truman, forcing the massive carrier to quickly change course to avoid being hit. It was successful, but in the process, an FA-18E fighter rolled off the carrier's deck and crashed into the Red Sea. That jet, which cost up to $73 million to build and is among the top 10 most expensive fighter jets in the world, now lies at the bottom of the very waterway the Houthis have targeted for so long. And on Tuesday, it happened again, when an FA-18F Super Hornet went overboard while attempting another landing on Truman. It's also worth pointing out that the US hasn't been alone in its Yemen strikes. ABC says that Israel has also taken part in several, conducting recent attacks against Yemen's main port, a pair of cement factories, and the Sana'a airport. The UK also launched a strike against a Houthi military facility on April 29. Perhaps that reveals why Trump is now so confident that he's achieved a ceasefire. The Houthis were faced with attacks from 3 nations, with the US leading the charge, that were devastating their bases in a country that the group is still fighting to control. All of this points to the US airstrikes in Yemen being a rousing success, at least in terms of the impact they've had on the Houthis. But as mentioned earlier in the video, things aren't quite as simple as Trump claims them to be. While he's telling the world that the US has achieved a ceasefire with the Houthis, we're getting mixed messages from the Houthis themselves. Furthermore, America's airstrikes may not have been as effective as they appear to have been, and even Trump himself is holding back on key details that would confirm whether the ceasefire is real or not. Starting with what the US has achieved, Reuters ran an interesting piece on May 7 in the wake of Trump's ceasefire comments. It pointed out that the extensive US airstrikes may have succeeded in the sense that they've damaged the Houthis and caused millions of dollars of damage to the group's military facilities. It also noted that the US claims to have hit over 1,000 targets across its 800 strikes, killing hundreds of Houthis in the process. However, the strikes didn't quite achieve what Trump hoped they would. The initial goal was to wipe out the Houthis. Given that the group survived this massive bombing campaign, the US has learned that the Houthis are far more resilient than Trump's team may have expected. That's confirmed by one official Reuters quoted, who said, "This operation shows the Houthis can survive pretty much any bombing campaign. Worse yet, the group is likely going to recover." That's according to Michael Knight, an expert on Yemen with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy think tank, who told Reuters, as long as the Houthis maintain a line of resupply to Iran and the Iranians continue to provide it, then it's not going to have any lasting effect. They can recover. Those supply lines haven't been broken, despite several attacks on Houthi-operated ports. All of this casts a different light on Trump's claim of a ceasefire. The US president is attempting to frame the ceasefire as a capitulation by the Houthis. In some sense, that's true. The militant group would be far happier not having to deal with constant missile and bomb attacks as it tries to further solidify its position in Yemen. However, Reuters' report reveals that the Houthis are far from beaten. They could have carried on, which perhaps means that the driving force behind this ceasefire was actually the United States. That viewpoint is supported by some strange comments Trump made beyond declaring the ceasefire. For instance, on May 7, Trump was surprisingly complimentary toward the Houthis, surprising many by commending the militant group on its collective bravery.
We hit them very hard. They had a great capacity to withstand punishment. They took tremendous punishment. And, you could say there's a lot of bravery there. It was amazing what they took. But we honor their commitment and their word.
These are interesting statements revealing that the US may have realized that it can't defeat the Houthis. At least it can't stop them using airstrikes alone. If the US committed its entire military might to taking out the group, then it would likely be a different story. But that isn't going to happen. For now, the US seems to be happy with the impact it's made and is now ready to withdraw rather than continue expensive assaults that are costing it millions of dollars per day. As interesting are the mixed messages we've since received about this new ceasefire. Those messages suggest there's a chance a ceasefire might not be happening at all, at least on the Houthis' end. Trump himself added to the uncertainty via comments he made in the Oval Office after he met with Carney. First, he reiterated that the US was entering a ceasefire state, noting that he'd ordered the military to pause its attacks a little while ago. Trump also dug deeper into his story that the Houthis themselves requested the ceasefire.
They've said, please don't bomb us anymore, and we're not going to attack your ships.
However, the US president held back some key details. When quizzed about who among the Houthis told the US that the group would stop their attacks, Trump simply said,
it doesn't matter where I hear it. The very good source, I could tell you. Very, very good source. Would you say, Marco? I would say pretty good, right, JD? A very good source.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio later added that the US airstrikes were always a freedom of navigation mission, but Trump's lack of transparency still raised questions. Why would the US president not confirm who he was talking to when bringing about this ceasefire? Some might argue that he wants to keep the source secret, perhaps so he has leverage in any future negotiations. You could also argue that Trump wants that information to remain classified as a military secret. However, stating that it doesn't matter who delivered the ceasefire confirmation from the Houthis raises the possibility that the Houthis haven't agreed to a ceasefire at all. A possibility that was made even more likely when the Houthis delivered their responses to Trump's claims. Though Trump positioned the ceasefire as a done deal on May 6, Houthi Supreme Political Council member Mohammed Ali al-Houthi implied that nothing had been agreed in the immediate aftermath. He suggested that the group would evaluate the US proposal on the ground first in an X post on the same afternoon that Trump made his claims. In other words, the US may have agreed to stop attacks, but the Houthis were still figuring out what they wanted to do. The good news is that the evaluation period appears to be over. A ceasefire is in place, though it's perhaps not the total ceasefire the US was hoping to achieve. India Today says that Houthi spokesperson Mohammed Abdul Salam has since confirmed that the Houthis have entered into a ceasefire with the US. However, he also made it a point to state that the ceasefire has no connection with our stance on supporting Gaza. That's a worrying statement. Why? It suggests that attacks in the Red Sea and other waterways to which the Houthis have access may continue against certain types of vessels. Which vessels are those? Any that the Houthis believe are owned by or have any links to Israel. That's according to Reuters, which revealed on May 7 that the deal struck between the US and the Houthis doesn't include sparing Israeli vessels from any of the Houthis' future operations. So, the attacks that the US aim to halt with its airstrikes aren't coming to a complete stop. Plus, if the past is any indication, the Houthis have a very loose description of what constitutes a vessel having ties to Israel. After all, the group has made this Israel claim before. Its initial Red Sea strikes were also supposed to be targeting Israeli vessels to show solidarity with Hamas. The reality was that many of the ships the Houthis struck had no connections with the group's main enemy at all. Therein lies a problem. A ceasefire seems to be in place. However, if the Houthis apply the same standards as to what constitutes an Israeli vessel going forward, as it has in the past, there may be little change in the Red Sea situation. The Maritime Executive made the same point in a May 7 article, noting that the Houthis have even gone so far as to attack ships that seem to have closer tie to Houthi allies than they do to Israel. Whether by accident or intent, it says there's a high chance that the Houthis' failure to agree to stop all Red Sea operations could lead to yet more attacks on seemingly neutral ships. That would put the situation right back to where it started before the US's most recent airstrikes. Zanetta chief analyst Peter Sand highlighted the uncertainty surrounding the ceasefire in a social media post following Trump's announcement. The one element of the container shipping market that affects freight rates the most may be nearing an end, Sand said in response to the ceasefire claims. But let's see if this is really happening. If transiting the Red Sea to its full extent is once again safe, the balance of the market will once again shift from its current tightness to one where overcapacity will depress freight rates. If that depression of freight rates happens, the US could claim a massive win. However, the Houthis' confirmation that they'll still conduct operations against Israeli vessels will put every container ship operator on edge, regardless of their ties. Any vessel seemed to be an Israeli vessel to the Houthis in the past. So will anything really change with this latest ceasefire? If it doesn't, the ships that are avoiding the Red Sea now will continue to do so, and nothing will change in the freight industry. What would the US do if that ended up being the case? The US likely doesn't want to jump back into the Red Sea fray, certainly not anytime soon. Beyond the nearly $300 million of equipment it's lost to Houthi counterattacks, the sheer scale of its Yemen airstrikes was starting to put a strain on the US budget. By April 4, the strikes had cost the US nearly $1 billion. Given that the strikes only grew more intense from there, it's a pretty safe bet that the US has spent well over $2 billion on its attacks against the Houthis, not counting the hundreds of millions of dollars in lost and destroyed equipment. Jumping back in if the Houthis' description of an Israel-linked vessel is as loose as it has been in the past would mean committing to spending billions of dollars more to eradicate the militant group once and for all. That's money Trump doesn't want to spend, and that means his proclamations of a ceasefire, combined with the Houthis' measured response, may not be as much of a victory as the US had hoped. The strikes will stop, for now. In the meantime, much hinges on what comes next, and it seems equally likely that hostilities will resume in the future as it does that the US has finally solved the Red Sea problem. But what do you think about the ceasefire between the US and the Houthis? Will it be effective given that the militant group is still saying that it'll attack Israel-linked shipping? Might the US find its way back into a battle over the Red Sea sooner rather than later? Let us know your opinions in the comments, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date news and information on the evolving situation between the US and the Houthis, the war in Ukraine, and other conflicts around the world.